In Detroit, there are neighborhoods where violence doesn't happen by accident. It follows rules, territory, retaliation. On the city's east side, one area became known by a single name, a name spoken quietly. The Red Zone. This is the story of the 7 Mile Gang War, the people who led it, the violence that spread across the city, and the federal case that finally brought life sentences. Federal prosecutors described the Red Zone as a stretch of Detroit's east side, roughly between 7 Mile and 8 Mile roads, and between Gratiot Avenue and Kelly Road. To the people who lived there, the Red Zone wasn't official. There were no signs, no lines painted on the street, but everyone understood what certain blocks meant and what could happen if you crossed them. The Red Zone was about control. Control of corners, control of movement, control enforced through fear. According to federal court records, the 7 Mile Bloods operated as an organized criminal group within that territory. Prosecutors said the group was involved in drug trafficking, illegal firearms, and repeated acts of violence. But what set this case apart wasn't a single crime. It was the pattern, a cycle of shootings, driven by retaliation, one act of violence answered by another. This wasn't random crime. This was a gang war. Federal investigators traced the escalation of violence to a series of retaliatory shootings. According to prosecutors, the conflict intensified after a 2014 killing, an event that set off years of revenge attacks between rival groups. Shootings spread across Detroit's east side. Some attacks were targeted, aimed at rivals or perceived enemies. Others weren't. Bullets struck cars, homes, and bystanders who had nothing to do with the conflict. Residents described hearing gunfire so often it became background noise, another sound of the neighborhood. What law enforcement saw was a sustained war. What the community lived with was constant fear. The war reached a turning point. On July 14th, violence erupted outside the Lawton Parole Office in Detroit, near the intersection of Grand River Avenue and Oakman Boulevard. This was not a random shooting. According to federal prosecutors, the incident was the result of an ongoing war between the 7 Mile Bloods, who claimed control of the Red Zone, and a rival alliance that included the Hustle Boys. That day, twin brothers Michael Davis and Martez Davis, admitted members of the Hustle Boys, were at the parole office for a scheduled meeting. After leaving the building, they got into a car with 2 other individuals. As they drove away, they were followed. Federal court records state that Billy Arnold, a parolee at the time and later identified as a leader of the 7 Mile Bloods, recognized the rival gang members at the office. Prosecutors say Arnold contacted Corey Bailey for backup. The 2 men tracked the vehicle carrying the rivals. Moments later, shots were fired. Witnesses and investigators later confirmed that gunmen leaned out of their vehicle and opened fire on the car carrying the Davis brothers and their companions. One of the victims, Juan Page, also known as Neff, was critically wounded. He survived the initial shooting, but died weeks later from his injuries. Another victim was seriously injured. Federal prosecutors said the killing intensified the Red Zone conflict, triggering a wave of retaliatory violence. Hit lists circulated on social media. Shootings followed. The gang war escalated, and Detroit paid the price. Years later, Billy Arnold was convicted of racketeering, multiple murders, and attempted murders. In April 2024, he was sentenced to life in federal prison. When federal prosecutors brought RICO charges, they named individuals they said were leaders and core members of the organization. Among those convicted in federal court were Corey Bailey, also known as Sonny, or Cocaine Sonny, convicted of RICO conspiracy, murder in aid of racketeering, attempted murder, and firearm offenses. Keithon Porter, also known as KP, convicted of RICO conspiracy, murder in aid of racketeering, and firearms charges. Robert Brown II, also known as RO, convicted of RICO conspiracy and violent racketeering offenses. Arlandis Shai, also known as Grimy, convicted of RICO conspiracy and firearm offenses. Federal sentencing records later showed life sentences for some defendants and decades in federal prison for others. This was no longer a street case. It was a federal dismantling. That shooting shook Detroit not only because of who was involved, but because of where it happened. A gang war had reached a probation office. A place designed to monitor and control violence had become part of it. It showed how deeply the conflict had embedded itself into everyday life. The red zone was no longer just a neighborhood problem. It was a city problem. The red zone didn't appear overnight. It was built through retaliation, silence, and years of unchecked violence. Federal court eventually shut it down. But the cost was paid long before the verdicts. In Detroit, some neighborhoods are remembered by street names. Others are remembered by what they survived.